Hi everybody, it's November 8th, 2025, and this is part of my video journal of my recovery from the trauma of watching my little brother Paul Kierans, 64 with Down syndrome, be locked away by his British Columbia New Democratic Party government group home for 588 days until he had a brain injury, some kind of brain incident. And they locked up Paul and terminated our visits after 64 years of our visiting at will and him living with me at my home one weekend a month. And also we traveled on holidays. I took him to Newfoundland twice. They locked him up when 3 days after I complained to the Burnaby RCMP police that there was what I believe to be a fraudulent and forged power of attorney created to give Paul the COVID-19 shot on February 1st of 2021. The group home had appointed my 82-year-old Catholic nun sister 4,000 kilometers away in Ontario as Paul's guardian. I tried everything. I went through the courts. I did everything civilly possible to try and restore our visits. I was allowed a 10-minute telephone call once a week. Paul begged me to visit him, and I was not allowed for 588 days. Then Paul had a stroke on some brain incident on April 13th of 2024, and 2 days later, the nun's lawyer emailed me and said that I could arrange a visit through him. So Paul lived for 10 days after the stroke, and I was allowed a 10-minute visit per day, although I sat in the hospital at Burnaby Hospital for 10 to 12 hours a day, just waiting to visit him. But I was only allowed a 10-minute visit under the supervision of this nun. She didn't fly in from Ontario for 2 days. Paul stayed alone with no visitors for 2 days after this brain injury. Well, I guess they were waiting for him to die or to see if he was going to die. And he appeared to me to be recovering. He sat up, he grabbed a book from my hands, turned the pages perfectly. He grabbed my hand and squeezed it. He made good eye contact. But on April 21st, I was called by Staff Sergeant Dean Urquhart of the Burnaby RCMP police, and he told me that he had been ordered by Ottawa to reopen the investigation into what I alleged to be a fraudulent and forged power of attorney. I know that it's a forgery because I taught Paul to print the only word that he could ever read or print, and that was his first name, Paul. It took me about a year as a little girl, and his signature was always very wrong, with letters in the wrong order or duplicates of letters or backwards letters. It was always very wrong, but somehow on this, what I alleged to be a fraudulent forged power of attorney, it was almost perfect. And he was too low functioning to choose or appoint a power of attorney or a representative, and if he had been able to, he would have never in a million years thought of or chosen the nun in Ontario, who he'd only met a few times over the course of his 64 years. So today is Remembrance Day is coming up in 3 days, and I posted a little video about my war hero, like real war hero uncle, Kevin Kierans, who I wish I had spent more time asking about his experience during World War II. He also was a peacekeeper on Cyprus, and he also was a special advisor to the United States Army in Vietnam. He actually was a Canadian soldier who went to Vietnam. And I followed his career and researched as much as I can, and that's created my interest in military history. But I just wanted to mention two other people. My uncle Dermot was the youngest of all of the Kierans brothers. So there was 6 boys and 2 girls, and he had a very bad time during World War II. He was much younger than Uncle Kevin, and I believe he became an alcoholic, and he died alone in Boston in the 80s, and nobody knew about it for several months, and my Uncle Kevin and my dad had to fly down to Boston to bring his body back. So that's sort of another sad outcome of or sacrifice made by these members of our armed forces. And I think he was as much of a hero, really, in his own way, as Uncle Kevin, although he obviously didn't receive the same recognition. But I also wanted to mention my father. My father he was 27 when World War II started. He was too old, really, to go into the armed forces. But he asked his professor, my father was an engineer, ultimately a world-famous engineer and professor of engineering, but he asked his professor if he should quit school and enlist with the armed forces. And his professor, because my father was also experienced glider pilot, and his professor, he told me this story, and his professor said, no, just keep doing what you're doing. And he worked underground as a safety engineer in Frood mine in Sudbury, in Frood nickel mine. Now, I don't know if you know, but Sudbury, when I last checked, produced 85% of the world's nickel, which is a very important metal used in manufacturing, particularly in manufacturing of weapons of war. And my father's one little mine, he told me that his mine, Frood mine in Greater Sudbury, produced 40% of all of the nickel used by the Allies. And not just Canada, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, the United States. His little mine produced 40% of the nickel used in World War II by the Allies. And they had to move at such a breakneck speed in this mining that they would lose 2 miners. It was considered to be as dangerous to be working underground as to be on the front lines in the armed forces. And my dad said they would lose 2 miners a week. And he, as the safety engineer, had to be the one to go and inform the loved ones of the worker that passed away. And he said that he learned to bring a doctor, a physician, and a priest, because the wife would always faint when informed of her husband's passing. And I asked my dad, how many people do you think you saved over the course of your career? So he worked underground in Sudbury for 20 years, while being the dad of 9 kids and raising 9 kids. And he said about 600. So he said he saw some things that you could just, like people crushed by falling rock, things that nobody should ever have to see. But the other thing that my dad did in the context of my brother is that when Paul was born in 1958, they had only discovered the mechanism that causes Down syndrome in 1958. And I don't think they even knew. It was Toronto Sick Children's Hospital where Paul was. And the physicians told my mom and dad to institutionalize Paul. That was the practice back then. They would place people with Down syndrome in these huge institutions, and the survival rate was very low. And Paul was particularly vulnerable, and he never would have survived. But my parents were told unequivocally to institutionalize Paul. And my dad said, hell no. My mother was unsure. She had never heard of Down syndrome before. She didn't know what it was. And she was the one that was going to have to do all the heavy lifting with Paul's care. So she was uncertain. But when Paul was ready to be discharged from the intensive care neonatal unit, my dad went down to Toronto and brought Paul back on the train all by himself, brought him back to Sudbury. And he stood by Paul through thick and thin. So I credit my dad for our family being able to have such a wonderful brother as Paul for the 66 years that we did get to see him and have him with us. But what I'm asking you to do is to please, and right now I have, after or before Paul died, but once my sister found out that she was being investigated by the Burnaby RCMP for this, what I alleged to be a fraudulent forged power of attorney, she applied to the court to have me declared a vexatious litigant. So that's a special, very rare designation that takes away my access to the courts in Canada, all courts, for every reason. I can't even respond to being sued without permission of a judge. And they did that to discredit me in the RCMP investigation of this fraudulent forged power of attorney. So I was declared a vexatious litigant after a 4-day hearing. And I appealed that to the Court of Appeal of British Columbia, and my appeal was dismissed. And I've appealed that decision to the Supreme Court of Canada. And all of the materials for that application for permission to appeal, you need permission in the Supreme Court of Canada even to proceed with your case. And it has to be a case of national importance. So everything was filed by September 3rd of 2025. And we're still waiting to hear back from the Supreme Court of Canada. And I like to think that no news is good news, but if you could possibly contact the media line for the Supreme Court of Canada and just ask for a status update on my case, which is Walker versus Kierans, file number 41902, that I would really appreciate it. So take care, everybody. I love you all, and have a happy and blessed Remembrance Day this Tuesday.